Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah. Here we're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav, and we'll be learning today Mirz Hashem Taf Kuf Yud Zayin Amid Beis. We are continuing to learn the halachas of the Dalaminim, and specifically the halachas that apply to the esrog. And we pick up today two lines off the bottom of Kuf Yud Zayin Amid Aleph in Siman Taf Reish Mem Ches Sif Tes. Says the Mishnah Berurah, says the Mechaber, also Chazazis. If a chazazis developed on the esrog. Now, a chazazis is something like a boil or a blister. It's some kind of a condition, I believe it's a fungal condition, where some kind of raised boils or blisters develop on the esrog. The Rama puts in parentheses here, Pirush Targum Oy Yalefes Oy Chazazan. We have in the pasuk by the mumim of a carbon, it says Oy Yalefes, and the Targum says Oy Chazazan. So there you can see the similarity between Chazazan and Chazazis. So also Chazazis alav, if this Chazazis condition developed on the esrog, says the Mechaber, it depends how extensive it is and where it's located on the esrog. If the Chazazis develops on 2 or 3 different places in the esrog, puzzle, then the esrog is puzzle. Now, the truth is, I just remembering now that we actually did read this already yesterday, and I just remembered that we mentioned the Bir Halacha that talks about this question of 2 or 3 places. But in any case, I'm going to go over this again because quickly there's very little Mishnah Berurah here. It says the Mishnah Berurah is kat lamed hey, also chazazis, bein betalush ubein b'mechuber. The Mechaber says it doesn't matter if the chazazis developed on the tree or it developed after the esrog was picked. When the Mechaber says also chazazis, that the chazazis developed, it's not the point of the Mechaber to say that if it happened while it was on the tree, it's okay. It's only a problem if also chazazis, if the chazazis developed later after it was harvested. That is not the intent of the Mechaber. The intent of using the word also, explains the Mishnah Berurah, is ela be'inan sheyeh gavaya mishar esrog. The chazazis condition, the blisters, the boils, have to be raised above the level of the rest of the esrog in order for them to be problematic. And the Mechaber said that if the chazazis develops in 2 or 3 different places on the esrog, it's puzzle. Says the Mishnah Berurah is kat lamed vav, puzzle the mechzi kimenumer. This is taken from the Gemara in lamed hey amid beis. It's mechzi kimenumer. It looks like a spotted esrog, spotted like a leopard, and that would be a lack of hadar, and that's why it would be puzzle. So here we had the first halacha here in Siftes. So we're discussing this chazazis condition, and we will actually be discussing this condition for the next several seifim. So we kind of have to keep track of the halachas that we see. The first halacha, if we have the chazazis in 2 or 3 different places on the esrog, that makes the esrog spotted, kimenumer, and since it's kimenumer, it's not hadar, and therefore it would be puzzle. Now, we're actually going to discuss soon in Sif Yud, we're going to discuss this halacha of 2 or 3 places in greater detail. However, let's first go weiter here in Sif Tes, where the Mechaber says, bottom line, halfway through the line, V'im b'makom echad. Let's say the chazazis condition is isolated to one area of the esrog. Now, I'm not 100% clear. I don't know. I don't think this necessarily means that there is one large blister. What this could mean is that the chazazis condition, which consists of raised blisters or boils, sometimes you could have one blister immediately adjacent to another blister so that there is no healthy esrog skin in between the 2 blisters. That would constitute one condition, one blister. We would not call that 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 different mekoimos on the esrog. So if you have multiple blisters right next to each other with no healthy skin in the middle, that's called makom echad. That's called a chazazis b'makom echad, a chazazis in one place. So here the Mechaber says, V'im b'makom echad, if the chazazis condition is on one place, then it depends. Im Allah al rubai, if the chazaz's condition is covering the majority of the area of the esrog, then puzzle. Then the esrog is going to be puzzle. Says the Mishnah Berurah, which begins back on Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph, Ois Kat Lamed Zayin, al rubai, if the chazaz's condition is on the majority of the esrog, hainu roiv kol shetach esrog, this means that it's covering the majority of the entire area. The shetach is the area. The entire area of the esrog, mishnei hatstadim, on both sides. So, I believe what the Mishnah Berurah is coming to head off over here is, let's say you had an esrog that had the chazaz's condition covering the majority of one side of the esrog. Now, you might be tempted to say that that's problematic, because if the majority of one side of the esrog is covered with a chazazis, normally when people see the esrog, they're looking at one side of the esrog. There's one side that's facing them. So if somebody is looking at that side of the esrog, he's going to see an esrog which appears to be a majority covered with chazazis, because the majority of the side that he's seeing is covered with chazazis. And from his perspective, that esrog would not be hadar. So you might think that it's enough to passel an esrog if the majority of one side of the esrog is covered with chazazis. Kamash Malan, the Mishnah Berurah comes to tell me no. When the Mechaber says that if the chazazis is covering roiv of the esrog, he means literally roiv of the esrog. It has to be a majority of the esrog on both sides, on all sides of the esrog. Now, just another thing I'll throw in over here is we have to realize that when we talk about a chazazis covering the majority of the esrog, it has to be covering a majority of the esrog, but it's not on the top of the esrog, on the chaitim, from the where it begins to taper and up. It's not on that part of the esrog at all, because we're about to see when the Mechaber continues, when the Mechaber is going to say that if the chazazis is located on the chaitim, on the tip, which is from where it tapers and up, if it's located over there, then even a koshehu, even if there's a tiny chazazis in one spot on the chaitim, the esrog is already puzzled. So when we talk about an esrog that's puzzled because the majority of it is covered with chazazis, we're talking about a majority of the esrog from the chaitim and down on all sides around the whole circumference of the esrog. Ais kat lamed ches, the Mishnah Berurah says puzzle, and the Mechaber said that the esrog that's roiv covered with the chazazis is puzzle, and says the Mishnah Berurah, why is it puzzle? De einoi hadar. So the root of the problem of chazazis appears to be a lack of hadar. An esrog that's afflicted with this condition, that has these boils or blisters, is not hadar. It's not a beautiful esrog. Now continues the Mechaber, top line, Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Beis, Ve'im al chotmoi. If the chazazis appears on the chaitim of the esrog, again, that's the top of the esrog, from where the esrog begins to taper and up, if it's located on the chaitim, and the Mechaber says, Hainu mimakoim shemaschel lehis katzer, the chaitim is from where the esrog begins to become narrow, ulehis chaded, and to become sharper, to become pointy, klape roishai. Now it happens to be that in the Paiskim, the Paiskim are a little bit puzzled about exactly where the chaitim is according to this explanation. You see, now I'm showing you kind of a profile of the esrog. And if you look at the profile of the esrog, it seems to begin to taper at about the midpoint of the esrog. It doesn't only start to taper at the top, it really, basically at the midpoint, is where it starts to go in. Now, if that's true, a tremendous amount of the esrog is called the chaitim. And there are many rayas that the Paiskim bring that cannot be what the Mechaber means. That the Mechaber must mean from a higher point on the esrog than the midpoint. And we find in the Paiskim different ways of understanding this. One of the things the Paiskim point out is that the Mechaber uses a very interesting double lashon. The Mechaber says, "Mimakom shemaschel lehis katzer," the point at which the esrog starts to become narrow, ulehischaded, and to become pointy, klape roshoi, near the top. So the Mechaber gave two different descriptions. One is where it starts to taper, lehiskatzer. Now again, that would seem to be at about the midpoint, maybe a little bit higher than the midpoint of the esrog, is where it starts lehiskatzer. That's where it starts to become narrow. You can see it maybe a little bit better in this esrog over here. I have this esrog already marked up for something that we're going to be learning soon. But again, you can see that it actually starts to become narrow. You know what? This is not, well, maybe on this side. It starts to become narrow already over here. That's already a little bit over the midpoint of the esrog. But is that where it starts becoming pointy? You can't say that it starts becoming pointy over here. In no way, shape, or form is the esrog pointy here. It doesn't even look like it's really headed to a point. It's just becoming narrower. Now let's go back to this esrog here. I think it's more appreciable on this esrog. You see, on this esrog, what we can see is that about over here, it starts to taper. It starts to become narrow and is gently sloping inwards. But then suddenly over here, it takes a very sharp rise. Here's where it's starting to become a point. Till here, from here until here, it's tapering, but it's not forming a point. From here and up, that's where it's starting to form a point. So many places want to suggest that that's actually the chaitim. So now, again, what's the Mechaber saying in this second halacha of Siftes? Ve'im al chotmai, if the chazazis appears on the chaitim, on the tip, on the top of the esrog, then afilu kol shehu, even if only a kol shehu, only a tiny bit of the esrog is covered with this chazazis, puzzle, the esrog is puzzle, and then the Mechaber goes on to define the chaitim. The chotmai hainu mimakim shabaskal ulehiskatzer ulehischadet klape roisha. Now let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah's Lamites. Afilu kol shehu puzzle. So the chaitim is treated much more chamor than the rest of the esrog. If you have a chazazis on a tiny spot on the chaitim, the esrog is puzzle. Explains the Mishnah Berurah, why is this true? Shenire sham la'einayim yoiser mishar mekoimos shaboy. The Mishnah Berurah says that the tip of the esrog is the most prominent and most visible part of the esrog. Sheba oisai shipua, because it's that slope of the tip of the esrog, adam noisan enov. That's where people look at your esrog. That's where people look at the esrog. When a person wants to see an esrog, how beautiful it is, they're not looking down here. When you hand them the esrog and they want to search the esrog and see, oh, is it a clean esrog? Then they search the whole esrog. But normally, when people first look at an esrog, it's the top of the esrog that they give the most attention to. And therefore, when it comes to the question of whether or not an esrog is hadar, or if there's a condition that takes away from the hadar nature of the esrog, the top is treated much more chomer than the rest of the esrog. Okay, now we go to Sif Yud, which is a little bit of a interesting sif, a little bit vague, I found it to be. And it's a little bit, to me, a little bit mechusar biur. It's a little bit lacking explanation. I had to reach out and search for some explanation. So the Mechaber says, in Sif Tes, we said that if the esrog is covered in 2 or 3 places with chazazis, then the esrog is puzzle. Why? Because it's mechsi kimenumar, because it looks like a spotted esrog. Now the Mechaber says in Sif Yud, yesh oimrim. There are those that say, and if you look at the Be'er HaGola, the Torah brings this down in the name of the Ravid and the Rosh. Yesh oimrim. There are those that say, when we say that if a chazazis develops on 2 or 3 places of the esrog is puzzle because it's mechsi kim and number, a simple reading of that halacha would seem to say, if this is your esrog, if you have one chazazis over here, that's 1. If you have another chazazis over here, that's already 2. If you have another chazazis Over here, that's 3. Okay, you have a chazazis in 3 spots. The esrog is puzzle. That's what a simple reading of Sif Tes would yield. Now in Sif Yud, the Mechaber says, Yesh Omrim, there are those that say, when we said in Sif Tes that when an esrog has a chazazis on 2 or 3 places, it's puzzle. Hainu dafka kishenispashet hanimur beruboy. That's only true if the spotted nature of the esrog, meaning the chazazis, is spread out over the majority of the esrog. Afal pi, even though shebeshetach habarburos, the actual area of the blisters, humiyut. So what the Mechaber is telling me here, he's qualifying the halach of Sif Tes. In Sif Tes we said, if you have a chazazis on 2 or 3 spots on the esrog is possible because mechzikim and number. Now the Mechaber says, there is a shita, there's a yesh omrim that says, when is it true that if the esrog has chazazis on 2 or 3 places, the esrog is possible? That's if the chazazis is spread out over roiv of the esrog, over the majority of the esrog. Now the chazazis itself, the blisters and the boils themselves, certainly do not cover roiv of the esrog. We know that because the Shulchan Aruch never gave us like a minimum size to a chazazis. A chazazis could be tiny. It could be a tiny raised blister on the esrog. So if you have 3 tiny raised blisters on the esrog, they're certainly not covering the majority of the esrog. What the Mechaber is saying here at Sif Yod, according to the Deya Rishona, is that in order to passel the esrog, the 2 or 3 chazazis have to be spread out over the majority of the area of the esrog. Why? Because if the chazazis, let's say this is the esrog, if you have 1 chazazis over here, and 1 chazazis over here, and 1 chazazis over here, it's very hard to say that the esrog is a spotted esrog. The whole damage to the esrog, the whole area of concern of the esrog is 1 small spot. Look what I just did. Let me see if I can get it to you on the camera. Okay. I circled an area over here, and I put 3 tiny dots in it. So let's say those 3 tiny dots, those are the chazazis. You have 3 blisters on the esrog. Now, they're all located within that black circle. But that black circle is covering a very tiny area of the esrog. And especially if I turn the esrog this way, you're not even going to see it. So are we going to say, based on those 3 blisters in that tiny circle, are we now going to say that this esrog is metzi kumanumer? This esrog is a spotted esrog, and therefore it's puzzle? That seems very odd. So this Deya Rishona, in the name of the Ravid and the Rush, what they're suggesting is the only time 2 or 3 chazazis could passel an esrog, because it makes the esrog a spotted esrog, is only if those 2 or 3 chazazis are spread out over roiv of the esrog, over the majority of the esrog. Now, all of you are wondering, and this bothered me as I was learning it right away. Excuse me. How on earth do we measure if the 2 or 3 chazazis are spread out over roiv of the esrog? How do we measure that? You have 1 chazazis over here, 1 chazazis over here, 1 chazazis over here. Is that called nispashet over roiv of the esrog? So the Chazon Ish gives us the answer to that dilemma. And this is why I have this esrog with push pins in it. Let's imagine that the push pins are the locations of the blisters. So we have a blister here, and then we have another blister down here. Says the Chazon Ish, what you do is, you take a thread, you turn off the light here, I think it might be easier to discern with a little less light. Okay. You see the thread? I have over here a thread. What I did was I wrapped that thread around the push pins. So now what I did was I took a thread and I ran the thread from blister to blister. And I surrounded all of the blisters with a thread. That's what the Chazon Ish says you do. The Chazon Ish says you take a thread and you make a circle. Doesn't have to be a circle. What you do is you enclose all of the blisters in one thread. And if by doing so, you end up surrounding the majority of the esrog in the thread, then the esrog is puzzle. Now again, note, is the majority of the esrog covered with chazazis? No. You've got one chazazis over here, one chazazis down here, and one chazazis back here. Is that the majority of the esrog? No. But when I take the thread and I surround all of the chazazis in a thread, I make a shape surrounded by a perimeter of a thread, and I make sure to enclose all of the blisters in the thread, you see we end up incorporating a very large portion. I didn't measure to see if it's roiv, but we end up incorporating a very large amount of the esrog inside that thread. And what the Mechaber is telling us here in the Day Rishona is, if you do that, and you end up incorporating the majority of the esrog in that thread, then the Day Rishona would say that that esrog is possible. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut mem. This is possible, even though the blisters themselves are certainly not covering roiv of the esrog. Pirish shabaka b'chabarburais atzmam hi hamiut. The area that's actually covered by the blisters themselves is only a miut. Okay, now let's go back up into the Mechaber and let's see the Deya Shniya. 3 lines down near the end of the line where we have a second opinion. Aval bimi. Well, this is part of the first opinion. So the first opinion said that the blisters have to the blisters have to be spread around over a majority of the area of the esrog. Aval bimiyutai, but if the blisters are only spread out over a minority, over a small portion of the area of the esrog, so again, if you take a thread and you enclose all of the blisters, you're only enclosing a small area on the esrog. Kigoyin, for example, shekulam mitzad echad shel esrog. Let's imagine that all of the blisters would be located on one side of the esrog, right? So let's say you had 2 blisters here, and let's say the third blister would be down here. If I would incorporate that with a thread, I would certainly only be incorporating a minority portion of the esrog, because I'm not even touching the whole other side. So aval b'miyuta kigoyin shekulam mitzad echad shel esrog kosher. Then, according to the Day Rishona, the esrog would be kosher. If all of the blisters would be on one side of the esrog, it would be kosher. Mashma, the implication of the Mechaber is that if part of one of the blisters would be going over onto the second side, mikri rubai, that automatically would be called roiv. Very interesting. What the Mishnah Berurah seems to be saying is, if you would have 2 chazazis on one side and another one on the other side of the esrog, that's an automatic roiv. Even without the Chazon Ish encircling it with a thread, maybe you could encircle that with a thread. I think you can. If you would have, so you have 2 chazazis over here. I'll make it even more clear on one side. Okay? You have 2 chazazis over here on one side. Now I have a chazazis over here on the other side. So on this side you see 1. On this side you have 2. Now the truth is, if I take a thread and I encircle those chazazis with a thread, I'm not going to be encircling roiv of the esrog. But, says the Mishnah Berurah, since it's on all sides, the chazazis is spread out over the whole hekif, the whole surround of the esrog, and therefore everybody would agree that that is possible. Okay, so that was the day of Rishayna. Now we go to the day of Shnia, 4 lines down the middle of the line. V'yesh paislim, says the Mechaber, there are those that passel the esrog, afilu b'miyutay shal tzad echad. There are those that say no, even if the chazazis is only spread out over a miut, over a minority of one side of the esrog. So in other words, it's 2 or 3 spots, but it's clearly not covering the majority of the esrog. It's not even covering the majority of one side of the esrog. It's puzzle. Says the Mishnah Berurah, cut membeis. I feel a bit yutai. Halavush ve'eli araba pasku kedei rishayna. They paskin like the first opinion. The chen mashma gamken b'prima gadim. She'ein pasal ad sheyispashe perubay. Miu, however, we should remember in nispashet gam latzad hasheni shel esrog, like we just said, if the chazazis are spread out over both sides of the esrog, even if it doesn't cover roiv of the area, everybody would say that that's called being spread out over roiv of the esrog, since it covers the majority of the circumference of the esrog. Pardon me for my ill manners of drinking from the bottle, but I'm out of cups from up here, and I do need to lubricate my throat. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol niyeh b'dvarim. Really a little bit not menschlich to be drinking from a bottle in the middle of a shir on a internet-wide video, but it's better than being mavatal Torah derabim and going and getting a cup when I'm out of cups. Okay. Now we go to Sif Yod Aleph. Says the Mechaber, Imhu mechza al mechza b'makom echad. Let's say you have a chazazis that is one continuous chazazis condition, and it covers exactly 1/2 of the esrog. So it's not roiv. It's covering 1/2 of the esrog. Yesh machshirim, v'yesh paislim. There are those that say that this esrog is kosher, and those that say that this esrog is puzzle. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Mem Gimel, Imhu mechza al mechza. So first, the Mishnah Berurah points out something very critical. When we say half of the esrog exactly, says the Mishnah Berurah, realize that cannot mean that it's covering one side of the esrog, let's say this side of the esrog, entirely from top to bottom, and the other side of the esrog has no chazazis on it at all. So now, that's mechza al mechza. One entire half of the esrog is covered from top to bottom. The other half of the esrog is completely clean from top to bottom. Says the Mishnah Berurah, can't mean that. Why? Very simple. Because if it's covered from top to bottom, that means that there's chazazis on the chaitim. And we learned already in Sif Tes that if there's chazazis on the chaitim, the esrog is puzzle, even if it's on only a kol shehu. Anything on the chaitim renders the esrog puzzle. That's what the Mishnah Berurah says here inside as Mem Gimel. This does not mean that half of the esrog is covered with chazazis from top to bottom, and the other half of the esrog is completely clean from top to bottom. Because on the chaitim, on the top of the esrog, even if there's just a tiny chazazis, it's already puzzle. The Chanal B'Sif Tes. Ella rather myri dahamechzi klape ukitz the chol hekef esrog. Instead, what it means is that from the chaitim and down, actually from the ukitz at the bottom, from the ukitz and up, exactly half the esrog is covered with chazazis all the way around. That's how you get mechza al mechza. There are those that say that this esrog, which is half and half, is kosher. Svir luhu, these Rishonim hold to efsher litzamtzem. This is a machlekes that we have in various places in Shas. Is it possible for the human eye or the human mind to measure an exact half? Mechza al mechza. You're telling me it's precisely. There was a bug. I saw it on the picture. I thought it was on my forehead. It was actually on the screen. You're telling me exactly 50%. Do we have the capability to measure exactly 50%? So, the sheet over here that says that the esrog is kosher if it's exactly 50%, holds, yes, you can measure. And since you measured and you arrived at the conclusion that it's exactly 50%, that means that the esrog is not covered by roiv of chazazis. And in order to be possible, it has to be roiv chazazis. You measured, it's not roiv chazazis, it's mechza al mechza, so it's kosher. Vayesh paislim sfiralu. However, the shittas that puzzle this esrog, they hold the ef shel tzamtzim. It's not possible for us to measure an exact, exactly 100% accurate 50%. We don't have, even nowadays, we don't have the measuring tools which will allow us to measure to the nth degree that, yes, it is mamish exactly 50%. And therefore, it might be roiv chazazis. So it's possible. Uladin halacha l'maisa, says the Mishnah Berurah, yesh lahachmer kedei basraisa, we should be machmer like the second opinion, midanakat oisa hamachaber l'basoif, because that's what the mechaber mentions at the end. Vayin b'prima gadim shakasav, the prima gadim writes, the loisagiv yomatzei roiv behekshra yidei medida. It's not enough to measure, to take someone look. Is this esrog roiv chazazis or not? So he'll whip out a ruler and start measuring with a ruler. It'll be centimeters, millimeters. I'll take out a micrometer. I'll start measuring. Says the Pri Megadim, no, it doesn't work that way. It has to be discernible by eye. You have to be able to look at it and say, oh, I see, it's not roiv chazazis. However, the Bekur Yaakov disagrees with that. Ayin Sham, he says, take a look over there. Okay, we're going to stop over here. We'll pick up Yis Hashem tomorrow with Sifyud Beis. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Discuss of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. Rabbi Hashem should say Yeshua's for us with Parnassus and Shidduchim to all those in need. And we should be zeichet to see the Bias Gal Tzedek B'mher of Yameinu. Amen. Be well.